I want to talk about a couple things that are in the permit and need to be dealt with on every new and redevelopment project that occurs in Eastern Washington. These are requirements that are not in Western Washington at this point in time and probably never will be. They were there, this one was there at one time, but the second one I'm going to talk about has never been in the West manual, the permits for the west side of the state. So this first one, requirement S5.B5.b, I says you need each jurisdiction needs to put an ordinance in place to new development, redevelopment sites that discharge to the MS4 and disturb 1 acre or more, or are less than 1 acre and are part of a larger common plan of development or sale. So what this means is that projects smaller than 1 acre in site by themselves, or are not part of a larger common plan of development or sale that becomes greater than 1 acre or more, are essentially exempt from stormwater requirements. So small projects on a new home on a 15,000 square foot lot, and you could be disturbing all 15,000 square feet, that project is exempt from stormwater requirements by permit. Now, the local jurisdictions have the ability, and I believe a few local jurisdictions on the east side of the state do require some sort of submittal for projects that are on project sites less than an acre. But they don't require the full 8 core element review for those project sites. Now, this deals with the permit. So if the project is going to want to follow the permit, they need to be more than an acre in size. The UIC rule has no minimum size requirement. So if you are planning on a project site that's less than an acre and they are discharging surface waters to UICs, those UICs must be registered regardless of whether that project site is an acre or more in size. There's no difference between the two of them. A second piece in here, in the same S5.B5.b, this is in section IIB, so it's further down. Permittees shall require projects approved under S5.B5, which is this whole approval process, to retain runoff generated on site for, at a minimum, the 10-year 24-hour rainfall event or a local equivalent. I know that Pullman, for example, it's very difficult to infiltrate in Pullman, so they have created a local equivalent that they passed by ecology for determination of if indeed that is considered a local equivalent, and they then apply that local equivalent jurisdiction-wide. But this is a key piece in the reviews of stormwater site plans. And then if you're following, if the project is following the core element process, if it's following the UIC process, you're keeping the 10-year stormfall rainfall event on site already, because you're keeping the 100-year rainfall event on site. So you're already meeting this requirement, whether you have to or not. So there are two things here. So as a comparison here between the permit and UICs, the permit has a requirement for the 1 acre or more. So project sites under 1 acre don't have to go through, if you want to follow the permit requirements, you don't have to follow through the requirements. If you're going to be using UICs, there is no minimum size project for UICs and registering UICs. So permit wise, there are these two requirements being placed on new and redevelopment projects on the east side of the state if you are following the NPDS permit. If you're going to get approval for your project for new and redevelopment through the core element process, you have a minimum requirement of 1 acre and you have to keep the 10-year storm on site. So what other things come into play up front before you even start having to get involved in doing a stormwater site plan? Because not every project, not every construction project on sites that are more than 1 acre necessarily require you to go through the stormwater process as well. So there are some exemptions that are in play, and ecology lists those in the manual as well as appendix 1 of the permit. There are some local exceptions and variances. So these are exceptions and variances are a single project exemption because of site specific issues that can be authorized by the local jurisdiction. They have to jump through some hoops in order to authorize those. Variances, for example, have to go out for public comment. Exceptions don't necessarily have to go out for public comment, but there are certain steps that must be followed for granting a local exception for a project, and they're there. And then there are thresholds as you work through the core element process. You have a regulatory threshold starting out for triggering just the need for the local drainage review. That's the 1 acre threshold that we talked about earlier. Then there's the project thresholds for, do you have to apply the core elements? If you're going to be discharging the surface waters, are you having to apply the core elements? And that's 5,000 square feet of new and replaced impervious surface in a project, or the certain amount of land disturbed. Those thresholds identify whether you have to even look at the core elements, whether your project's even big enough, even if it's more than 1 acre, and you don't disturb more than 3/4 of an acre, and you don't have more than 5,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface, you may not have to do the core elements. And then there's a third set of thresholds that come into play for treatment and flow control. So just because you have more than 5,000 square feet of new and replaced impervious surface doesn't mean you have to do treatment and flow control. There are additional thresholds you have to deal with as you're working your way forward. So what are our exemptions? What exemptions do we have in place? We have full exemptions. Don't have to worry about it if you're doing forest practices that are under certain definitions, and commercial agriculture as specifically defined in the permit. There are types of commercial agriculture that qualify and types that don't. And then there's a set of road and parking area preservation / maintenance activities that have full exemptions. I mean, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to do things during construction. And now partial exemption, there are some projects with partial exemptions. And what that means is you only have to do core elements 1 and 2, meaning you have to deal with stormwater, and you have to deal with stormwater during construction, which is core element number 2. And those apply to things like underground utility projects. So if you have a pipeline in the street that you need to replace, and you're digging up the street, removing the pavement, digging up the street, but you have more than 5,000 square feet of surface material that you removed and put back in, that's still exempt as long as that's the only thing the project consists of. But you have to take care of stormwater during construction. So you have to watch out to what happens to the piles of dirt you build up on the side. You have to make sure that doesn't leave the site. You have to protect the catch basins that are in place. So you have a partial exemption. But that partial exemption, that has to be the project by itself. We've had people try to take a 2-acre commercial site that is being installed, and they have to go out in the street and replace the water line or build a new water line to connect to the existing system and build a new sewer line to connect to the existing system. And they say that, oh, well, that work out in the street, that is exempt from the core elements 3 through 8. It isn't. It's part of the overall project and therefore is not exempt. It has to be a project by itself in order to be exempt. Safety improvement projects are things like adding shoulders, putting barriers along the edge of roads, putting in walking lanes, things like that. Those have partial exemptions. There's construction going on that needs to get controlled during the construction. And there's also some road and parking area things that have partial exemptions. So what has full exemptions? So potholing, square cut patching, crack sealing, resurfacing with in-kind materials, overlaying asphalt or concrete with BST, shoulder grading, reshaping and grading drainage systems, doing vegetation maintenance. Those are completely exempt from the stormwater requirements. Small amounts of work don't necessarily increase the amount of impervious surface, don't increase the amount of runoff you're going to get, are doing things that help us to deal with runoff. And now partially exempt. So removing and replacing of concrete or asphalt to base course or subgrade or lower without expanding or improving the impervious surface. So this is already an impervious surface that is draining off, draining. You are not increasing the amount of flow. You are not increasing the amount of pollutants. So, but while you're doing this, we want you to take care of it during construction. We don't want runoff happening during construction. That's bad. Now, in Eastern Washington, this is partially exempt. In Western Washington, this is defined as replaced hard surface. And they have to deal with runoff from these areas. In Eastern Washington, it is not. But you got to recognize that this talks about without expanding or improving the surfaces. Okay, you can't go from gravel to concrete. All right, that's one later down here. Repairing roadway base or subgrade, that's exempt. And then overlaying gravel or overlaying BST with asphalt without expanding the area of coverage. We apply it on certain amounts of ADT. We're looking at bigger roads. So if you're changing gravel to asphalt on a larger road, we're going to probably get an increase in pollutant load. And we want to deal with that increase in pollutant load. And that's why we're considering that only partially exempt. And the parking with less than 40 strip ends per 1,000 square feet or less than 100 total trip ends is partially exempt. And if you exceed either one of those, you have exceeded and you are now no longer partially exempt. So you don't have to exceed both. You just have to exceed one of them to become partially exempt.